Jon drove at him again because driving at him was the only option, and the Night King stepped inside the swing, and the ice blade came toward Jon's face, and he threw himself sideways, and the cold edge opened a line along his cheek, and he went down on one knee in the snow with Longclaw still in his hand and the Night King above him, unhurried, raising the ice blade for what would settle it. The Night King looked at him on his knees in the snow, and he did something Jon had not expected. He smiled. It was not a human smile. It carried none of the warmth the word implied, none of the invitation. It was the smile of something that has already won, and is simply allowing the winning to be acknowledged. He dropped the ice blade into the snow with a sound like a bell struck cold, and he walked toward Jon with the unhurried certainty of something that has no concept of being stopped. Jon tried to rise. His legs gave. He got one hand on Longclaw, and the Night King's boot came down on the blade, pinning it into the frozen earth, and one enormous hand closed around Jon's throat and lifted him from the ground as though the weight of him was not a consideration. Ghost drove at the Night King's flank, and the remaining White Walkers closed around the wolf before he reached him, 3 of them, moving with the controlled purpose of things that had done this before. Ghost fought with everything he had. He could not get through. Jon heard him, the howl cut short by the press of pale bodies. Ghost could do nothing. The hand around his throat was cold in a way that went deeper than cold. It was the cold of 8,000 years, the cold of everything that had been claimed and held and would never be warm again, and Jon felt it moving through him, through his veins, his chest, the edges of his vision. Not killing him, changing him. The Night King watched his face as it happened, watched with those ancient eyes as Jon's exhausted gray irises began, at the very edges, to lighten toward the pale blue of the turned. Arya moved. Certainty was a blind spot. She had been taught that in the house of Black and White. Men who were certain they had won stopped attending to what they had not won yet. The Night King had not felt her presence in the way he felt the presence of every living thing on the battlefield. The heat, the fear, the small distinctive signature of someone trying to survive. Arya was not trying to survive. She was moving like purpose, like the absence of hesitation, and the Night King's ancient and absolute attention, distributed across an army of tens of thousands, had left this one blind spot, the person who had trained her whole life to be exactly this. The White Walkers had not seen her either, their pale eyes tracking the obvious threats, the fighters with Valyrian steel, the noise and heat of the battle, finding in Arya's stillness only stillness. Bran watched from the weirwood. He had seen this in the network, had seen 10,000 versions of what was about to happen in the long sight of the trees, and he knew that the next 5 seconds contained everything. Arya came out of the shadow, with the catspaw dagger driving upward. The Night King had not seen her coming. He was faster than anything living, and she had known that. He heard her or felt her or simply knew, the way he seemed to simply know things, and he dropped Jon and turned to intercept her, stepping back to avoid the dagger. He caught her wrist. The grip was the same cold as the one around Jon's throat, the same ancient, absolute cold. He grabbed her throat and her vision flared white at the edges, not changing her, killing her. The catspaw dagger fell from her hand. Jon dropped. His knees hit the snow and the blue was still at the edges of his eyes, and his hands were shaking, but Longclaw was no longer pinned, and he had spent his entire life learning to move, when moving was the only thing left. He drove upward into the Night King's side from his knees with Longclaw, and found the place where dragonglass had entered 8,000 years ago that Valyrian steel could reach, and drove through it with everything he had. The Night King looked down at the blade in his side. He looked at Jon. He looked at Bran beneath the weirwood, at the 3-eyed raven, the keeper of memory, the record that could not be unmade. He looked at Arya, still in his grip, who looked back at him without flinching. Starks, the wardens of the north, the people charged since the first long night with standing between the world of the living and what came from beyond the wall. The certainty in his eyes did not disappear so much as arrive at its end. 8,000 years of purpose, finished. He shattered. Arya landed as the grip released, hand finding the dagger in the snow. She was on her feet before the pieces finished falling. The White Walkers still stood, and she drove the catspaw dagger through the first before it had completed turning toward her, and it shattered. The second turned to strike Arya, but she evaded and found an opening under the arm. As the White Walkers began to retreat, Ghost pinned the third as Arya pierced it in the neck above the armor. Arya went to Jon. She crossed the broken ground of the godswood and dropped to her knees in front of him, exhausted, the catspaw dagger loose in her hand. Ghost moved behind her, settling at her back. The great white wolf, still and immense, pressed close in the way of something that had decided she was worth guarding. Arya was breathing hard. Jon was breathing hard. Neither of them spoke. Bran watched them from beneath the weirwood with those quiet, ancient eyes. Jon looked at Arya. Arya looked at Jon. Then they both looked at Bran. The 3 of them were still in the broken and burning godswood, the 3-eyed raven, the young woman who had trained her whole life for a single night, and the man who had died and come back and spent years standing at the edge of the world. Nothing needed to be said. They looked at each other across the firelight and the cold and the silence after the end of something very old, and nothing needed to be said.